Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about bridging art, activism, and academia to build more just futures. I'm Cathy Hannabach, and today we're taking a look at the complex relationship between the United States and the Philippines during the Cold War, and how that history shapes Filipino America today. I sit down with Josen Masangkay Diaz, an associate professor of ethnic studies and women and gender studies at the University of San Diego, as well as a core member of the Asian Solidarity Collective. Josen's new book, Postcolonial Configurations, Dictatorship, the Racial Cold War, and Filipino America, analyzes Filipino-American social formations through a study of Philippine-U.S. Cold War politics. In our conversation, Josen and I explore the role of race, nation, and gender during the Cold War, particularly how they were renegotiated in the wake of decolonization and the post-colonial nation-building projects that followed. We discussed Josen's research into how post-colonial projects undertaken during the Ferdinand Marcos dictatorship, as well as during various U.S. presidencies, transformed relations across the Transpacific. These projects bound together cultural diplomacy, immigration law, and humanitarianism, with struggles over political and economic influence in the region. We also delve into the politics of what it means to name and remember the intimate interactions between fascist authoritarianism and liberal democracy. Memory is something that we get into in detail, both the power relations inherent in what is remembered and how on both national and transnational scales, but also how memory and memorialization are key sites for resistance as folks remake what Filipino America means today. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure. It's great to be here.
So your new book, Postcolonial Configurations, explores the pretty complicated relationship between the United States and the Philippines during the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos from the 1960s through the 1980s. What are some of the key flashpoints in that relationship that you analyze across the chapters of the book?
One of the things I try to get at is that the U.S.-Philippine relationship isn't just a colonial, neo-colonial one, but it's one that was, I think, made more complex and, really evolved through the politics of the period. And so that includes things like Cold War counterinsurgency, concerns around post-colonial sovereignty, concerns around nation building, the utility of authoritarian rule, not just for Marcos, but also for the United States. And so I focus on a few key points that I think really encapsulate a lot of those things that I'm interested in and concerned with. So the first is the U.S. Immigration Nationality Act of 1965. It kind of coincided right when Marcos was elected, but as a lot of us know, it ended some of the most restrictive immigration mandates on the books in the United States, including national quotas that really set the stage for the influx of new immigrants from Asia, from Latin America, an entirely new Filipino American diaspora. I'm interested in it because it also aligned with some of the Philippine governmental programs and reforms that were passed under Marcos, including the Balikbayan program of 1973, which gave visiting Filipinos from the United States and from Western Europe privileges and access to things that other people in the Philippines didn't have access to. So I look at that relationship, right? What the U.S. Immigration Nationality Act did in ways that coincided with some of the more liberal reforms Marcos passed during his presidency. I'm also deeply, strangely fascinated with Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos's visit to Washington, their state visit in September of 1966. And this was right after he was elected. Marcos was elected to the presidency. And here the Marcoses are negotiating with President Lyndon B. Johnson over things like financial support. They're negotiating about things like Philippine support during the Vietnam War. But I think they're also, in a lot of ways, introducing Marcos to the global stage as this kind of new strongman in Asia, as this person who is capable of taking the Philippines to new heights, of establishing some collaborative relationships throughout the Transpacific. So I think that's a really important visit, but it's also this visit where Imelda Marcos visits the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, and according to her, it's a kind of catalyst for imagining cultural programs, humanities and arts programs in the Philippines as well. So she has this wild story where she explains to Rockefeller that this is what she wants to do, right? She wants to build her own Lincoln Center in the Philippines. And for me, it kind of embodies their ambition, but also this way of imagining the Philippines that other leaders, according to them, had previously not. So I'm really fascinated by that example. Right after the state visit, the Marcoses actually hold the Manila Summit in the Philippines in October of 1966, and this was part of Johnson's More Flags effort to bolster international support for the U.S. war in Vietnam. The people in attendance were, of course, Johnson, but also presidents from Thailand, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, South Vietnam. And so you have this kind of Transpacific PR, I think, campaign for Johnson about, showing the kinds of support that he supposedly had in Asia. But in a lot of ways, it was also for the Marcoses a kind of celebration of the Philippines' arrival to the New World Order. They put out all the stops. They made it into a giant barrio fiesta, into a festival of performing their rise to power. So I think all of those examples in the book embody for me a lot of how the U.S.-Philippine relationship in some ways stays the same from earlier decades, but is also starting to shift and change as well during the Cold War.
In the US, at least, and in a lot of other countries as well, the Cold War is often represented, particularly in hindsight, as primarily a political and economic battle over communism. But what's, I think, fascinating about the particular case studies that you look at in the book is you show how central race and gender and culture were to the Cold War, both in the Philippines and in the US. So this is not just a political and economic phenomenon. What was one of the most surprising examples that you found in your research into how race and gender operated in that context?
Right, as you say, the Cold War is often represented as one that focuses on threat, on the question of communism, but for me, it's always also encapsulated all the battles and discourses that a threat makes possible. So I really see the Cold War as a period where language and the representation of race and gender actually start to shift and change in really meaningful ways. So for me, my most interesting example is the building and the construction of the Philippine Refugee Processing Center in Bataan in 1980. And this coincides with the passage of the Refugee Act in the United States as well. This is, I think, complicating the U.S. refugee relationship to show how Filipino teachers in particular are operating as a kind of intermediary between U.S. benevolence on the one hand, but also refugees as the object of freedom and liberty on the other hand. So Filipino teachers are showing the world in some ways the success of the colonial model by teaching English, by teaching Western cultural norms. It's important to note that English has been such a key aspect of the U.S. colonial model in the Philippines. In this chapter, I focus in on the Refugee Processing Center. I'm showing how the English teacher is also wrapped up in a kind of affective work, which is coded as feminized labor. So try to take the conversation about care work, which is important within Filipino studies, and put it within the context of refugee rehabilitation to show how the labor of care is actually fulfilling but also confounding the bigger refugee project. It's also actually showing us the complex relationship between the teacher and the refugee. I think there's a relationship there that actually disrupts the project of rehabilitation. It's one of the more pressing examples of how we see race and gender shift in the context of the Cold War, how we see it take shape in interesting ways, I think, in Asia and in the Philippines in particular.
In that chapter about refugee education, and another one of the chapters that's primarily about the figure of the new Filipina, which was invented in this same period, you look at humanitarianism and human rights, both as instruments that have been enormously helpful for progressive social movements in the Philippines and in the US, but have also been deployed by conservative regimes, both in the Philippines and in the US, to justify all kinds of violences, from neocolonial occupation to martial law to eugenicist population control. What do you hope readers come away from those chapters understanding about humanitarianism and human rights?
Yeah, I love this question, Cathy. I think it's exactly as you say, right? It's both and. Human rights activists were and and continue to be key in organizing campaigns against the dictatorship, against the corrupt regimes throughout the Philippines. So they were incredibly instrumental in shedding light on the human rights abuses that were happening throughout the 70s and 80s. In my book, I'm thinking about the ways that Marcos tries to get around these critiques. And a lot of his speeches, his writing, much of which was actually written by ghostwriters, he goes through a kind of definition of the human and humanity that's seeking to justify his power. He's saying that these development programs will get Filipinos closer to the idealized human condition. So he tries to cultivate ideas about the human that, again, are trying to justify his own rule. He, as well as Imelda Marcos, are talking about human rights as a distinctly kind of Western formation, right? Like, what do they know about what we're going through? He is spending some time trying to lay out to a public how human rights itself is a kind of colonial or imperialist imposition. So he's trying to kind of come up with his own definition of humanity. My study of the Philippine Refugee Processing Center specifically, I am focusing on Western ideas of humanitarianism that think of humanity again as something to be bestowed upon the refugee, something to be given, and also seeing the relationship between the teacher and the refugee student as something that's much more complicated. So within the processing center, for example, there's these kinds of hierarchies of the human, I think, that get torn apart, for instance, when the teacher and the student start to think about their affinities with each other. They start to think of themselves as rooted in shared experiences of war. It really tries to upend what our definitions of the human are. What are they rooted in? In what ways are they no longer helpful? And in what ways are some of the people that I'm studying actually trying to redefine what human rights mean? And so in the end, I hope readers follow me through analysis of the limits and possibilities of human rights.
Another key theme that I've noticed across this book is memory, and specifically how national memory and one's personal memory often diverge and cohere and make a mess of both of those things.
Right.
Particularly when you're dealing with the wake of really heavy events like colonialism, like martial law, like war, declared or otherwise. How do you see memory and memorialization shaping Filipino American politics today?
I begin the book by talking about memorials, and I try to argue that Filipino America is a type of memorialization. So the ways we choose to remember don't just come up in, monuments we put up or the days we commemorate, but it's also about how we think about and name Filipino America, what that means in relation to other political struggles. So what happens if we think about the election of Bongbong Marcos, who's Ferdinand Marcos' son, who was just elected to the presidency? What happens when we think about that election as a distinctly Filipino-American issue and not as a Philippine issue only? I think it lends itself to reflecting about the consistency of U.S.-Philippine politics, about the efficacy and importance of transnational organizing, about how race actually operates both within, but especially also outside the U.S. context. Throughout the book, I try to think about Filipino America as something that's not only prefigured only as diaspora, right? It doesn't just name a diaspora, but it's actually more apt to think about it as a contentious and shifting set of relationships that become solidified for a particular purpose during the Cold War. It helped me think about Filipino America as having a more intimate connection between other struggles for self-determination throughout Asia, throughout other places, but also struggles against settler colonialism in the Transpacific. It's more important for me to think about it in that way as opposed to this kind of static thing that only exists within one specific geographic diasporic context.
I think the way that you're reframing a lot of these questions that might be familiar to folks within Filipino American studies, within Filipino studies, within a range of related fields, is giving a new way to conceptualize events that perhaps we think we already understand or we already know. In many ways, reimagining what those things have meant to people, what they mean to current people, and what they can mean differently in the future. I think it's a really interesting example of imagining otherwise, of rethinking what we want the world to be. So in the spirit of that and in the spirit of this podcast, I'll ask you the giant question that I love to end every interview with, which is, what is that world that you're working toward when you're doing this kind of research, when you're doing this kind of teaching, when you're doing the work that you do in the world? What kind of world do you want?
Yeah, it's such an important, such a great question. And I think it's helpful to kind of come back to that question, even as we maybe lose it through some of the more intricate parts of the research. So I want an anti-fascist world. That's the one I want. I want one that allows for creativity, allows for self-determination, allows for hope to thrive. The question about memory is such a key one for me. I try to work towards a world that remembers. And what I mean by that is not just trying to return to some past bygone time, but joining others in the work towards a world that envisions life worlds that we haven't yet realized, but we dream about and we know is possible, right? It's not something we see exist, but we know it's there. I'm trying to work towards a world that isn't concerned with heroes necessarily, but in the everyday work of cultivating and practicing forms of life making that are rooted in care, they're rooted in collectivity and relationships, where we understand our lives really intertwined with others that take us outside of ourselves.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing all of these ways that you imagine otherwise.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cathy. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of Imagine Otherwise, and a big thanks as well to Josen for sharing her work. You can learn more about Josen's new book, Postcolonial Configurations, as well as her other projects on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you'll also find a teaching guide for this episode, as well as related books and resources. Want to support Imagine Otherwise? We would love it if you would share this episode with a friend or consider teaching it in your classroom. You can also subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.